They told Elara Jensen that the frontier had only one law: kill or be killed. In the Arizona Territory of 1881, kindness was often mistaken for weakness, and mercy was a death sentence. But on a morning when the San Pedro River swelled with a violent flash flood, Elara made a choice that would terrify the bravest men in Tombstone. She didn't just save 2 drowning children. She saved the sons of a ghost. And when the sun rose the next morning, the horizon didn't bring the warmth of day. It brought 70 painted warriors, silence, and a debt that had to be paid in blood. This is the true-to-life story of the woman who stood between 2 worlds and the dawn that changed the West forever. The Arizona Territory didn't just break people. It ground them into dust and let the wind carry them away. Elara Jensen knew the taste of that dust better than most. At 32, she was already a relic of a harder time. A widow living on the outskirts of the Dragoon Mountains, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor and 10 miles from the relentless noise of Tombstone. Her cabin was built from rough-hewn pine, fortified against the heat and the constant threat of drifters. Her husband, Thomas, had died 2 years prior, not from a bullet, but from a rusted nail and the fever that followed. Since then, Elara had managed the 40 acres of scrubland alone. She had hands that were calloused like leather and eyes the color of flint, eyes that watched the horizon constantly. It was late August, the time of the violent monsoons. The sky had been a bruised purple for 3 days, swelling with rain that refused to fall until the middle of the night. When it finally broke, it wasn't rain. It was a deluge. The heavens opened up and hammered the earth with a ferocity that shook the timbers of her cabin. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt tangible. But it wasn't quiet everywhere. From her front porch, Elara could hear the roar. The San Pedro River, usually a lazy, shallow creek this time of year, had transformed into a monster. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, grabbed her Winchester rifle, more out of habit than necessity, and walked down the slope toward the water's edge. She needed to check the fence line. If the floodwaters had taken the posts, her mule, Barnaby, might wander off, and he was the only thing keeping her plow moving. The air was thick with the smell of wet creosote and mud. As she neared the bank, the ground became soft and treacherous. The river was a churning ribbon of brown sludge, tearing at the roots of cottonwood trees and carrying debris from miles upstream. Whole logs, dead coyotes, and pieces of unrecognizable wagon gear bobbed in the violent current. Elara stopped, her boots sinking slightly into the muck. She scanned the opposite bank. It was Apache land over there, Chiricahua territory. The tension in the valley was palpable. Rumors had been flying through Tombstone that a splinter group of warriors had left the reservation, led by a war chief whose name was whispered in fear, Naiche. She was about to turn back, satisfied that her fence was intact, when she saw it. Or rather, them. 50 yards upstream, caught in the crook of a fallen mesquite tree that was barely clinging to the riverbank, were 2 dark shapes. At first, Elara thought it was livestock, calves perhaps, swept away from a ranch up north. Then, one of the shapes moved. An arm flailed, striking the muddy water. Elara squinted against the rising sun. A cry pierced the roar of the water, thin, high-pitched, and terrified. "Help!" It wasn't English. It was a guttural, desperate sound, but the universal language of panic needed no translation. Elara stepped closer to the edge, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw them clearly now. 2 boys. They couldn't have been more than 8 and 10 years old. They were clinging to the branches of the dead tree, their bodies battered by the rushing debris. Their long, dark hair was plastered to their faces, and their buckskin tunics were soaked and heavy. Apache. Ilara froze. The instinct of the frontier kicked in. Do not engage. Do not intervene. To help an Apache in 1881 was social suicide. To be found with them was often a literal death sentence, either by the hands of the soldiers who hunted them or the warriors who would assume she had kidnapped them. The older boy was trying to push the younger one up onto the trunk of the tree, but his strength was failing. The current surged, snapping a branch. The younger boy slipped, his head going under the brown water. Ilara didn't think. She didn't calculate the politics of the territory. She didn't think about the warnings Sheriff Amos Grady had plastered all over town about red devils. She dropped her Winchester in the mud. "Hold on!" she screamed, though she knew they couldn't understand her. She scrambled down the slick bank, her skirts tangling around her legs. The water was freezing, shock cold against the desert heat. It grabbed at her ankles immediately, trying to pull her into the center channel. Ilara fought the current, wading waist-deep toward the snag. The water pushed against her chest, heavy as lead. She gasped as a piece of driftwood slammed into her hip, bruising the bone. But she kept moving. She reached the tree. The older boy looked up at her, his eyes wide, filled with a mixture of terror and defiance. He bared his teeth, a small knife clutched in his trembling hand. He was ready to fight her, even as he drowned. "No!" Ilara shouted over the roar, holding out her hands, palms up. "No fight! Up! Get up!" The tree groaned. The roots on the bank were giving way. Ilara lunged forward. She grabbed the younger boy by the back of his tunic, just as the branch he was holding snapped. He went limp, exhausted. She hauled him against her chest, his small body shivering violently. The older boy slashed at her, the knife grazing her forearm. A line of red bloomed on her white sleeve. "Stop it!" she roared, grabbing his wrist with a strength developed from years of chopping her own wood. "The tree is going! Move!" Something in her tone, or perhaps the sheer desperation of the moment, broke through his defenses. He stopped fighting. Ilara grabbed him by the arm. "Now!" She pulled them both away from the snag, just as the mesquite tree tore free from the bank. It tumbled into the main current, rolling over and over like a chaotic wheel, smashing into rocks downstream. If they had been on it, they would be dead. But they weren't safe yet. They were chest-deep in a flood, 3 distinct targets in a killing field, and Ilara Jensen had just committed treason against the unwritten laws of her people. Getting out of the river was harder than getting in. The weight of the wet buckskin and Ilara's heavy wool skirts made every step a battle. The mud sucked at their feet, trying to keep them as permanent fixtures of the San Pedro. Ilara threw the younger boy, who was barely conscious, over her shoulder. She gripped the older boy's hand so tight her knuckles turned white. "Dig in," she commanded, panting. "Use your feet." They clawed their way up the bank, slipping and sliding until they collapsed onto the dry, scrubby grass. Ilara lay on her back, staring up at the vast, indifferent blue sky, her lungs burning. Beside her, the boys coughed up river water, retching and shivering. She sat up, wiping wet hair from her face. She looked at her arm. The cut the boy had given her was shallow, but stung. She looked at him. He was staring at her, his dark eyes analyzing every inch of her face. He didn't look like a child. He looked like a soldier who had lost his weapon. He said something to the younger boy in a low, rapid dialect. The younger one, looking pale and sick, nodded weakly. Ilara stood up, her wet dress clinging to her frame. "We can't stay here," she said, gesturing toward the house. "Soldiers patrol this ridge. If they see you—" She drew a line across her neck with her finger. The older boy understood. He stood up, helping his brother. They walked in silence to the cabin. Ilara scanned the horizon constantly. If a neighbor, like Old Man Miller, who ran cattle to the east, saw this, the sheriff would be at her door by sunset. And Sheriff Amos Grady was not a man known for his understanding. He was a man who measured his success by the number of hostiles he buried. Inside the cabin, the air was still and warm. Elara bolted the heavy oak door. It was the first time in 2 years she had felt the need to lock it during the day. "Sit," she said, pointing to the rug by the hearth. The boys hesitated, looking at the strange objects, the cast-iron stove, the ticking clock on the mantel, the portrait of Thomas. The older boy kept his hand near his waist where his knife was sheathed. Elara ignored the threat. She went to the stove and stoked the embers, adding kindling until a fire roared. She filled a kettle with water. "You're hungry," she stated. It wasn't a question. They looked gaunt, their ribs showing through the wet leather. She brought out dried beef, biscuits from yesterday, and a jar of peach preserves. She placed the plate on the floor and stepped back. The boys didn't move. They watched her. Elara took a biscuit, tore a piece off, and ate it. "Good," she said. "Safe." The younger boy couldn't resist. He lunged for the food. The older one tried to stop him, then relented, taking a piece of beef and eating it slowly, his eyes never leaving Elara. As they ate, Elara moved to the window, peering through the crack in the curtains. The valley was empty. But she knew that wouldn't last. The storm would bring people out to check their lands. She turned back to the boys. The younger one had finished eating and was now curling up on the rug, exhaustion winning over fear. The older boy remained seated, rigid. "What is your name?" Elara asked softly. He didn't answer. She pointed to herself. "Elara." He remained silent. "You need dry clothes," she said. She went to the trunk at the foot of her bed. It contained Thomas's old things. She pulled out 2 flannel shirts. They would be like gowns on the boys, but they were dry. She handed them to the older boy. He took them cautiously. Then he spoke. His voice was rough, unaccustomed to the language. "My father," he said, pointing toward the mountains in the south. "He come." Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. "Your father?" The boy nodded solemnly. "He track rain. He track us." Elara swallowed hard. If these boys were who she suspected they were, Chiricahua, perhaps from Naiche's band, their father wouldn't be coming alone. He would be coming with a war party. And if they found their sons in the home of a white settler, they wouldn't ask questions first. They would burn the cabin to the ground with her inside it. But if she turned them out now, they would die of exposure or be shot by the ranchers. "Let him come," Elara whispered, mostly to comfort herself. "But until then, nobody sees you. Nobody." She moved to tend to the younger boy, intending to check him for fever. Suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the yard. Not the rhythmic, unshod hooves of Apache ponies. These were heavy, iron-shod hooves, the sound of cavalry or lawmen. Elara froze. The older boy was already on his feet, the knife back in his hand. "Hide!" Elara hissed, pointing to the trap door beneath the table that led to the root cellar. "Now!" She grabbed the plate of food and shoved it into the cellar, practically throwing the boys down into the dark hole. She dropped the heavy wooden door shut and dragged the rug over it, just as a heavy fist pounded on her front door. "Elara, open up! It's Sheriff Grady!" Elara's heart slammed against her ribs. She smoothed her hair, checked her wet dress. There was no explaining that away, and unbolted the door. Sheriff Amos Grady stood there, filling the frame. He was a large man, with a red face and a mustache that drooped over his mouth. He smelled of tobacco and stale whiskey. Behind him sat 2 deputies on horseback, rifles resting across their saddles. "Sheriff," Elara said, keeping her voice steady. To what do I owe the pleasure? Grady looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her soaked skirts. You been swimming, Ilara? Little early for a dip. The fence, she lied quickly. Flood took a post. I tried to save it, fell in. Grady chewed on his tobacco, his eyes narrowing. He didn't believe her. He stepped inside without asking. Bad flood, he said, glancing around the room. Washed a lot of trash downriver. We found fresh tracks near the bank, Ilara. Small prints, moccasins. Ilara's blood ran cold. I didn't see anything, she said, moving to stand between him and the table. Grady walked to the hearth. He looked at the fire. Awful big fire for a warm morning. He turned, his gaze landing on the floor near the rug. There, glistening in the firelight, was a single, small drop of river mud, and next to it, a small leather pouch, a medicine bag that had fallen from the boy's neck. Grady bent down and picked it up. He held it up to the light, a cruel smile spreading across his face. You didn't see anything, huh? He tossed the pouch onto the table. Ilara, you're a terrible liar. Now, where are the savages? The silence in the cabin was so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against Ilara's eardrums. The only sound was the damp crackle of the fire and the heavy, rasping breathing of Sheriff Amos Grady. He stood there, the small, beaded medicine pouch dangling from his thick fingers like a trophy. It was deerskin, dyed with yellow ochre and stitched with sinew, unmistakably Apache. Ilara didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet were planted on the rough pine floorboards as if they had taken root. She knew that directly beneath the soles of her boots, through 2 inches of wood, 2 hearts were beating in terror. If she stepped aside, if she faltered, the floor would become a killing ground. Grady took a step forward, his spurs jingling, a sound that usually signaled law and order, but now sounded like the approach of an executioner. I asked you a question, Ilara, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low pitch that vibrated in the small room. Where are they? You got hostiles under your floorboards, or maybe in the loft? I found that pouch by the river, Ilara lied, her voice surprisingly steady, though her hands were trembling behind her back. It washed up with the drift, just like the rest of the trash. Grady laughed, a dry, humorless bark. Washed up? Dry as a bone inside, I reckon. And the mud on the floor? That washed up too? Right to the middle of your parlor? He dropped the pouch onto the table and rested his hand on the pearl handle of his Colt Peacemaker. Step aside, woman. I'm going to check that cellar. Ilara's mind raced. She had no weapon on her person. Her Winchester was in the mud by the river. The shotgun was leaning by the back door, 5 feet away, too far to reach before Grady drew. But on the cutting board behind her, resting next to a half-sliced loaf of stale bread, was her butcher knife. It was an ugly thing, the blade worn thin from years of sharpening, carbon steel stained dark with use. You have no right, she said, backing up until her hips hit the counter. This is my home. You have no warrant. I am the law in this valley, Grady sneered, and the law says harboring renegades is treason. Now move, or I'll move you. He lunged. It wasn't a graceful move. It was the clumsy, arrogant shove of a man used to getting his way through size alone. He reached for her shoulder to toss her aside. Ilara didn't think. The frontier instinct that had sent her into the river flared again. She grabbed the handle of the butcher knife and swung it in a frantic, defensive arc. The blade didn't hit him, but it flashed inches from his face, forcing him to stumble back, tripping over his own boots. He crashed into the heavy oak table, sending the medicine pouch sliding to the floor. "You crazy witch!" Grady roared, his hand flying to his gun. "Get out!" Ilara screamed, holding the knife out with both hands. "Get out of my house, Amos! I swear on Thomas's grave, I will gut you like a hog if you take one more step." For a second, time froze. Grady stared at her, genuinely shocked. He had known Elara Jensen as the quiet, grieving widow who came to town once a month for flour and nails. He hadn't known this version, the one with wild hair, mud-stained skirts, and the eyes of a cornered cougar. Grady's gun was half drawn. He could have shot her. In 1881, a sheriff shooting a woman who pulled a knife on him might have raised eyebrows, but it wouldn't have led to a hanging. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the ferocity in her eyes. Maybe it was the knowledge that killing a white woman to find Apache children would start a different kind of war in Tombstone, one he couldn't control. "You're making a mistake, Elara," he hissed, his face flushing a deep, dangerous purple. "A mistake that's going to get you dead. You think you can protect them? From me?" "I'm protecting my home," she retorted, not lowering the knife. "Sheriff!" The shout came from outside. It was one of the deputies. Grady didn't take his eyes off Elara. "What is it, Silas?" he yelled over his shoulder. "Rider coming in hot from the South Ridge. Says he saw smoke signals, big ones, near the dragoons." Grady's expression shifted. The hunter's gleam was replaced by the calculation of a soldier. The dragoons were 10 miles away. If there were signals, it meant a war party was moving. He holstered his gun slowly, never breaking eye contact with Elara. "You hear that?" he whispered. "That's their daddy and his friends. You think you're saving those boys. You're just fattening them up for the slaughter. If the Apaches come here, they won't thank you. They'll peel the skin from your bones while you scream." "Get out!" Elara repeated, though her voice wavered. Grady straightened his coat. "I'm going. We got to ride to the pass and cut them off, but I ain't leaving you unspooled." He walked to the door and kicked it open. "Silas!" he barked. "You stay here. Watch the house. If anyone comes out, anyone, you shoot them. I don't care if it's the widow or the Pope. You understand?" "Yes, Sheriff." Grady turned back to Elara one last time. "I'll be back at sunup with the dogs. If those whelps are in here, I'll burn this cabin down with all of you inside. Enjoy your night, Elara. It'll be your last." He stomped out. A moment later, the sound of galloping horses faded into the distance, leaving behind only the wind and the ominous heavy thud of Silas's boots pacing on the front porch. Elara lowered the knife, her knees buckling. She slid down the front of the cabinets until she hit the floor, gasping for air. She was trembling so violently she almost dropped the blade. She was trapped. A deputy with a repeating rifle was 10 feet away on the other side of the wall, and beneath her, in the dark, were 2 children whose father was apparently burning the world down to find them. She crawled to the trap door and pulled the rug aside. She lifted the heavy wood. 2 pairs of eyes stared up at her from the gloom of the root cellar. The older boy had the knife in his hand again. He hadn't made a sound. "It's safe." "For now," Elara whispered, the adrenaline crashing out of her system, leaving her exhausted. "Come up. Quickly." The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in bruised hues of violet and blood orange. Inside the cabin, the shadows lengthened, turning the familiar furniture into strange, looming shapes. Elara didn't dare light a lamp. A light would outline them against the windows, making them perfect targets for Silas, who was still pacing on the porch. Every few minutes, the floorboards creaked as he shifted his weight or spat tobacco juice into the yard. The boys sat at the table, eating the rest of the bread and peach preserves. Now that the immediate threat of the sheriff was gone, the reality of their situation settled in. The older boy, whose name Elara learned was Nante, watched the window with the intensity of a hawk. The younger one, barely 7 years old, was named Halion. He was falling asleep, his head bobbing over his plate, exhausted by the trauma of the river. "Your father," Ilara whispered, sitting across from Nante. "Who is he?" Nante stopped eating. He looked at her, his face unreadable in the twilight. He traced the grain of the wood on the table with a finger. "Naiche," he said softly. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. Naiche, the last hereditary chief of the Chokonen Chiricahua, the son of Cochise. He wasn't just a warrior, he was royalty among his people, and a ghost to the US cavalry. He was supposed to be on the reservation, or halfway to Mexico. If Naiche was here, in the valley, looking for his sons, he wouldn't bring a raiding party. He would bring an army. "He will come," Nante said, his English broken but clear. "He saw the water take us. He follows." "If he comes here," Ilara said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice, "the sheriff will kill him, or the soldiers will. There are patrols everywhere." Nante shook his head. "Naiche does not die, but he does not know we live. He thinks the river ate us. If he thinks we are dead." The boy trailed off. Ilara finished the thought for him. "If he thinks you're dead, he will kill everyone in his path out of grief." Nante nodded. "He needs to know. We must speak to the mountain." "Speak to the mountain?" Ilara asked. Nante pointed to the high chimney of the cabin. "Smoke, green wood, the way of the coyote?" He struggled for the word, then made a motion with his hand, a broken, rhythmic puff of smoke. "A signal. 3 puffs. Wait. 3 puffs." Ilara looked at the fireplace. "If we light a fire now, Silas will see the smoke. He'll know." "Night comes," Nante said. "Smoke hides in dark. But fire shows." He was right. In the dark, the smoke would be invisible against the black sky, but the sparks and the glow would be seen from the porch. Unless... Ilara looked at the stove. It was a cast-iron beast, vented through a stovepipe that went up through the roof. If they were careful, very careful, they could create smoke without the light being seen from the ground level. But the deputy was right outside the door. If he smelled burning green wood, he'd come in. "We can't use the stove," Ilara said. "Silas will smell it. He's sitting right by the door." She paced the room, her bare feet silent on the wood. She needed a distraction. She needed to get Silas away from the porch, long enough for Nante to climb out the back window and signal from the ridge behind the house. But if Nante was seen, he would be shot on sight. She looked at Nante. He was holding his medicine pouch, the one Grady had dropped. He was praying, silently. "Can you ride?" Ilara asked suddenly. Nante looked up. "Yes." "My mule, Barnaby. He's in the lean-to out back. He's stubborn, but he's quiet." "No ride," Nante said. "Horse makes noise. Feet are better." "The deputy is watching the front." Ilara formulated the plan as she spoke. "The back window opens to the gully. If you crawl, you can get to the ridge, but you need fire to make the signal." Nante pulled a small flint striker from his belt. "I have fire." "It's too risky," Ilara muttered. "If Silas hears you." She looked at the younger boy, Halion, asleep on the table. He looked so much like Thomas had when he was sick, vulnerable, innocent. These weren't savages. They were children, and their father was out there in the dark, a grieving king ready to burn the world. "I will help you," Ilara said, a steely resolve settling over her. "But you must do exactly as I say." She went to the cupboard and pulled out a bottle of whiskey Thomas had kept for special occasions. It was cheap rot gut, but it smelled strong. She also grabbed a tin cup. "I'm going to go out there," she told Nante. "I'm going to talk to him. Keep him busy. When I cough, loudly, you go out the back window. Take Halion." "No," Nante said. Halion stays. He is too slow. I go alone. I signal. I come back. No, Ilara said. If you go, you keep going. Run to your father. Nante looked at her, his dark eyes fierce. I do not leave my brother. I do not leave you. Naiche will come. He must know we are here. The loyalty of the boy stunned her. He could escape, but he wouldn't leave his brother. Okay, Ilara breathed. Go. Signal. Come back. But be a ghost, Nante. Be a ghost. She smoothed her hair, unbuttoned the top button of her dress to look disheveled and harmless, and picked up the whiskey bottle. She walked to the front door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She opened the door. Silas spun around, his rifle snapping up to his shoulder. Get back inside, Ilara. Easy, Silas, she said, raising the bottle. Her voice was trembling, which wasn't acting. I can't sleep. The storm. The quiet. I thought maybe you were cold out here. Silas lowered the rifle slightly, licking his lips. He was a young man, barely 20, and the prospect of a lonely night watch was grim. The bottle looked inviting. Sheriff said no contact, he grunted, but his eyes stayed on the whiskey. Just a cup, Ilara said, stepping onto the porch. The cool night air hit her face. To settle my nerves, and yours. I don't want any trouble, Silas. I just want this night to be over. She poured a splash of amber liquid into the cup and held it out. He hesitated, then reached for it with his free hand. Quickly, he muttered. If Grady finds out. He won't, Ilara said, forcing a smile. She moved to the edge of the porch, leaning against the railing, forcing Silas to turn his back to the house to face her. Cough. She let out a loud, hacking cough, covering her mouth. Dust, she apologized. This wind kicks up everything. She prayed Nante was moving. Inside the cabin, Nante was a shadow. He didn't make a sound. He slid the sash of the back window up. It groaned slightly. On the porch, Silas stiffened. What was that? Ilara's heart stopped. What? I heard something. Inside. It's the house settling, Ilara said quickly, pouring more whiskey into his cup. The wood swells when it rains, then shrinks. It creaks all night, drives me mad. Silas narrowed his eyes, listening. Silence. He took a sip of the whiskey. The burn seemed to relax him. You shouldn't be hiding them, Ilara, he said, his voice softer, slurred slightly by fatigue and alcohol. If they're in there, it's not right. They killed my uncle in 78, skinned him. Ilara looked at the boy's face, the pain and hatred etched into it. I'm sorry about your uncle, Silas. Truly. But I haven't seen anyone, just the river. Behind the house, in the deep gully that cut through the property, Nante was moving. He didn't run. He flowed. He was barefoot now, having discarded the oversized boots Ilara had offered. He felt the earth, the vibrations, the wind. He climbed the ridge, moving through the prickly pear and catclaw acacia without disturbing a single spine. He reached the crest, where the silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains loomed black against the stars. He gathered a handful of dry grass and green creosote branches. He struck his flint. A spark. Another. The grass caught. He fed the fire, letting it flare up for a second, a bright orange eye opening in the dark, then smothered it with the green branches. Puff. 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 3 distinct columns of white smoke rose into the starlit sky, illuminated briefly by the embers before vanishing. He waited. Ilara, on the porch, was running out of things to say. She had asked about Silas's mother, his horse, his boots. He was getting suspicious again. I should check the back, Silas said, stepping away from the railing. No, Ilara said, grabbing his arm. I mean, have another drink. Please. I don't want to be alone right now. Silas looked at her hand on his arm. He blushed. "Mrs. Jensen, Suddenly, a sound tore through the night. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a shout. It was the cry of a coyote. But it was wrong. It was too rhythmic, too deep. It echoed from the mountains, bouncing off the canyon walls. Yip-yip-hoo-oh-hoo, yip-yip-hoo. Silas froze. That ain't a coyote. Ilara's heart soared. It was the answer. Nante, on the ridge, heard it too. He smiled, a fierce warrior's smile. He scrambled down the slope, sliding on the loose shale, racing back to the window. He slipped inside just as Silas pulled away from Ilara. "I'm checking the back," Silas said firmly. He walked around the corner of the house, his rifle raised. Ilara stood on the porch, holding the empty whiskey bottle. She looked toward the mountains. The cry came again. Closer this time. Naiche had seen the signal. The ghost was coming. And he wasn't alone. Ilara went back inside and bolted the door. Nante was there, breathing hard, smelling of smoke and sage. He nodded to her. "He comes," Nante said. "At dawn." Ilara looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 2:06 a.m. They had 4 hours until sunrise. 4 hours until the sheriff returned with his dogs. 4 hours until the collision of two worlds that would likely leave nothing but ash in its wake. She went to the corner and picked up the shotgun. She broke the breech, checking the shells. "Then we wait," she said. 4:15 a.m., the hour of the wolf. The darkness inside the cabin was total, save for the faint, dying orange glow of the embers in the stove. Ilara sat in the rocking chair facing the door, the shotgun resting across her lap. Her hands were cramped from gripping the cold steel, but she didn't dare relax. Beside her, on the floor, Nante was sharpening his knife against a smooth river stone he had found in the hearth. Shk, shk, shk. The rhythmic sound was the only thing keeping Ilara grounded. Hallion was asleep again, curled up under the heavy quilt, his breathing hitching every so often as he dreamed of the drowning water. "They will bring dogs," Ilara said softly, breaking the silence. "Sheriff Grady keeps bloodhounds for tracking escaped convicts from the Yuma prison. If they come, the cellar won't hide your scent." Nante didn't look up. "If dogs come, I kill dogs." "If you kill the dogs, the men will shoot," Ilara countered. "We need a new plan." She stood up, her joints popping, and moved to the window. The moon had set, leaving the valley in an abyssal blackness, but down the road, perhaps a mile away, she saw it. Pinpricks of light. Lanterns, bobbing and weaving like fireflies, but moving with the speed of galloping horses. "They're early," Ilara whispered, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. He didn't wait for sunup. Sheriff Grady was a man of vengeance. The humiliation of being threatened by a woman with a butcher knife had likely festered in his mind all night, driving him back before the light could reveal his cruelty to the rest of the town. "Up!" Ilara hissed. "Nante, wake your brother." She dragged the heavy oak table across the room, jamming it against the front door. It wouldn't stop them, but it would slow them down. She then moved to the bedroom, pulling the mattress off the frame and shoving it against the window facing the road. The sound of the horses grew louder, a thunderous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. And then the sound she had feared, the deep, baying howl of hounds catching a scent. "They know," Nante said. He was standing by the back wall, his small body tense as a bowstring. "Get in the loft," Ilara commanded, pointing to the ladder that led to the small storage space above the rafters. "Pull the ladder up behind you. Do not make a sound, no matter what happens to me. Do you understand? No matter what." Nante hesitated. "I fight. You die if you fight." Ilara grabbed his shoulders, shaking him. "If you die, your brother dies. If you die, your father has nothing to come for. Go!" Nante looked at her, his eyes burning with a mixture of warrior pride and childish fear. He nodded once, grabbed Hallion, and scrambled up the ladder. He hauled the wooden rungs up after him, disappearing into the shadows of the roof, just as the cavalcade of riders skidded to a halt in the yard. "Elara Jensen!" Grady's voice boomed through the thin walls, louder and angrier than before. "I know you're in there, and I know you got company. The dogs are going crazy, Elara. They smell 'em!" Elara pumped the shotgun. She stood behind the overturned table, leveling the barrel at the door. "Get off my land, Amos!" she screamed. "I told you I'm armed." "And I told you I'm the law," Grady yelled back. "Break it down." There was a heavy thud as a boot, or perhaps a log, slammed into the door. The wood groaned, and the table scraped an inch across the floor. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a farmer, a widow, a survivor of droughts and fevers. She was not a soldier. But as the door buckled under a second blow, a cold clarity washed over her. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for the two terrified hearts beating in the rafters above her. Crash. The upper hinge gave way. The door hung crookedly, revealing a slice of the pre-dawn night and the silhouette of a man. Elara didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. The buckshot tore through the upper corner of the doorframe, showering the intruder with splinters and plaster. It was a warning shot, aimed high, but it had the desired effect. The man, one of the deputies, a man named Beck, yelped and scrambled back. "She's shooting! The crazy witch is shooting!" Beck screamed. "Hold your fire!" Grady bellowed from somewhere in the dark. "Don't kill her yet! I want the boys alive!" Silence fell over the yard, heavy and suffocating. The smell of gunpowder filled the small cabin, sharp and acrid. "Elara," Grady's voice came again, calmer now, laced with a venomous patience. "That was your one mistake. You fired on an officer of the court. Now I don't need a warrant, and I don't need to be gentle." "Send the dogs," Grady commanded. Elara fumbled to reload the shotgun, her fingers shaking. She heard the chain rattle, and then a low, vicious snarl. Two massive bloodhounds bounded onto the porch, squeezing through the broken door. They didn't go for Elara. They went straight for the ladder's resting place, baying at the ceiling. "They're in the loft!" Beck shouted. Grady stepped into the doorway, a lantern in one hand and his Colt Peacemaker in the other. He saw Elara trying to snap the shotgun breech closed. He didn't speak. He just marched forward and backhanded her across the face with the barrel of his pistol. The world exploded in white light. Elara crumpled to the floor, the taste of copper filling her mouth. The shotgun skittered away across the planks. Grady loomed over her, his face twisted in a sneer. "You chose the wrong side, darling." He looked up at the dark opening of the loft. "Come down," he roared, "or I start shooting through the floorboards." There was silence from above. Then a small, dark shape dropped from the rafters. It wasn't a boy. It was Nante, landing like a cat, the butcher knife he had stolen earlier, flashing in the lantern light. He lunged at the nearest dog, slashing its flank. The hound yelped and scrambled back. Nante turned to Grady, baring his teeth, a feral, terrifying scream tearing from his throat. He was 10 years old and facing a giant, but he held his ground like a Spartan. "Don't shoot him!" Grady laughed, holstering his gun. "Grab him!" 3 men rushed in, Silas, Beck, and a ranch hand named Miller. They swarmed the boy. Nante fought with the fury of a trapped badger, biting, kicking, slashing. He caught Miller in the thigh with the knife, drawing blood, but he was simply too small. Beck slammed the butt of his rifle into Nante's ribs. The boy gasped, the air leaving his lungs, and collapsed. "Get the other one," Grady ordered, pointing to the loft. Silas climbed onto the table and reached into the rafters. He pulled down a weeping, terrified Halion. Ilara groaned, pushing herself up on her elbows. Her vision was swimming, but she saw Nante pinned to the floor, blood trickling from his nose, his eyes locked on hers. He wasn't crying. He was waiting. "Tie them up," Grady said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "And tie her up, too. We're going to have a hanging, boys, right here in the front yard. Let's see if that brings their daddy out of the hills." They dragged Ilara and the boys out onto the porch. The air was cold, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple as the sun threatened to rise. They shoved Ilara down onto the dirt of the yard, binding her hands behind her back with rough hemp rope. Nante and Halion were tied to the porch railing, displayed like trophies. Grady lit a cigar, the flare of the match illuminating his satisfied grin. He looked at the eastern horizon. "Sun's coming up, Ilara," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Reckon this is the end of your story." Ilara spat blood into the dust. "You're a fool, Amos," she rasped. "You didn't listen." "Listen to what?" "The coyote," she whispered. Dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains, not with the promise of warmth, but with the color of spilled blood. Sheriff Grady tightened the knot on the cottonwood branch, ignoring the trembling of his horse. He dragged Nante toward the makeshift gallows, the boy's face bruised but defiant. "Last chance to pray, boy," Grady sneered, the madness of the night hardening into cold cruelty. "Beck, get the widow up. She watches." "Sheriff," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "Look." Grady spun around. The eastern ridge, moments ago empty, was now lined with silhouettes against the blinding sun. They sat motionless on their ponies, lances held high, feathers fluttering in the morning breeze. There were not 5 or 10. There were 70. "Mother of God," Grady breathed. Before the posse could raise their rifles, the ridge erupted. The Apache warriors didn't scream. They descended like a landslide, a thundering wall of dust and hooves. They encircled the cabin in seconds, cutting off every escape route. The deputies dropped their weapons, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the force. A single rider broke the circle. He was a giant, his chest painted with white clay, riding a paint horse. Naiche, the ghost of the territory. He rode straight to the porch, ignoring the lawman, his eyes locked on his sons. He dismounted, knife in hand. Grady, sensing his end, panicked. He raised his Colt Peacemaker, aiming it at Nante's head. "Back off! I'll kill them! I swear I'll—" Crack! The shot didn't come from the warriors. It came from the dust. Ilara, having writhed her bound hands to her front, had dragged a fallen Winchester across her lap. She fired upward. The bullet struck the porch post inches from Grady's face, sending splinters into his eyes. He flinched, blindingly distracted, and in that split second, 2 warriors tackled him, pinning him to the earth with a spear tip at his throat. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Naiche cut the ropes binding Nante and Halion. He held them for a brief, fierce moment, then turned to Ilara. He walked to her, slicing her bonds with a single stroke. "You speak with the gun," Naiche said, his voice deep and resonant. "Nante says you went into the river. You gave them breath." Ilara rubbed her wrists, standing to face the war chief. "They are children." Naiche looked at Grady, groveling in the dirt. "He is Indar. Enemy. We will stake him out for the ants." "No," Ilara said, her voice shaking but firm. "If you kill a sheriff here, the army will burn this valley. They will hunt you, and they will hang me. Let him live." Naiche studied her, impressed by her cold logic. He nodded. "A life for a life." He signaled his men. They dragged Grady to his horse and shoved him into the saddle. "Go!" Naiche commanded. "Run." Grady and his deputies fled, disappearing into the dust. Naiche turned back to Ilara, pressing a heavy silver bracelet into her palm. "The soldiers come soon. We go to Mexico. But know this. As long as Naiche breathes, this land is safe. You are Sikis." He mounted his horse, pulled Halion up behind him, and raised his lance. As quickly as they had arrived, the 70 warriors vanished into the heat waves of the morning, leaving Ilara alone with the silence and the silver in her hand. Ilara Jensen never left the San Pedro Valley. In the years that followed, the Indian Wars reached their bloody crescendo. General Crook and later General Miles swept through the territory, hunting the Chiricahua, until Geronimo and Naiche finally surrendered in 1886. The newspapers in Tombstone were full of stories of raids, burnings, and death. Ranches on all sides of Ilara's property were struck, cattle were stolen, and settlers fled to the safety of the towns. But not Ilara. Her cabin remained a strange, silent island in a sea of violence. It became local folklore that whenever a war party moved through the valley, they would ride wide around the Jensen homestead. Travelers and drifters soon learned that if they wanted safe passage through the territory, they didn't need a cavalry escort. They just needed to camp within sight of Ilara's fence line. Sheriff Amos Grady never returned. He resigned a month after the incident, claiming his nerves were shot, and moved to California. The deputies who had been there that dawn spoke of the event only in hushed tones in the back of saloons, swearing that the widow Jensen had bewitched the Apache. Ilara kept the silver bracelet in a wooden box on her mantel, right next to Thomas's picture. She lived to be 84 years old, passing away in her sleep long after the frontier had been tamed and fenced. When her niece came to sort through her belongings, she found the bracelet. It was polished bright, as if Ilara had held it every day. She had saved 2 boys from the water, and in return, the water of violence had parted around her for the rest of her life. In the end, Ilara proved that in a land ruled by gunpowder, the most powerful weapon was, and always had been, a single act of mercy. Ilara Jensen's story reminds us that history isn't just written by the victors or the generals. Sometimes it's written by the quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to let hate dictate their actions. She stood between a corrupt lawman and a grieving father, and in doing so, she carved out a peace that lasted a lifetime. If this story moved you, or if it made you think about the untold histories of the Wild West, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And I want to know what you think. If you were in Ilara's shoes, standing on that riverbank, would you have jumped in? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. We have plenty more forgotten legends of the frontier coming your way. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next campfire.